If a therapist could speak to child Michael Jackson, they would likely see this: a child never allowed to become an adult. The creator of Neverland, the inventor of the moonwalk, the legendary king of pop, all were the product of survival mechanisms of a little boy who was abused, deprived of love, and thrust under the spotlights far too young. If these kinds of stories catch your attention, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Where are you watching us from right now? Let us know in the comments below. On August 29, 1958, in a small house in Gary, Indiana, Catherine and Joseph Jackson welcomed their 8th child into the world. Michael Joseph Jackson entered a household already bursting with children, activity, and ambition, particularly that of his father, a failed musician with a dream of success through his offspring. No one could have imagined that this newborn would become the world's biggest pop star, or that his extraordinary success would be inextricably linked to the trauma of his earliest years. The story of Michael Jackson's rise to unprecedented fame is well documented. His journey from the Jackson 5 to solo superstardom, from ABC to Thriller, has been recounted countless times. Less understood is the parallel psychological journey, how the frightened, talented child became the complex, troubled adult who would eventually be dubbed Wacko Jacko by tabloids that once celebrated his genius. To understand Michael Jackson the man, we must first understand Michael the child, and the formative experiences that shaped his psychology in profound and lasting ways. The Jackson household under Joseph Jackson's rule was a place of strict discipline and relentless work. A former boxer and crane operator at U.S. Steel, Joseph ran the family with an iron fist, literally. By all accounts, including Michael's own testimony in multiple interviews, Joseph regularly beat his children as both punishment and motivation, with Michael receiving particularly harsh treatment as the family's breakout star. "He would make me so nervous that I'd vomit when I saw him," Michael recalled in his 2003 documentary with Martin Bashir. "He would just look at me and that's all it would take, and I would start throwing up. He was rough. The way he would beat you was hard." This physical abuse was accompanied by psychological cruelty. Joseph regularly told Michael his nose was too big and mocked his appearance, planting seeds of insecurity that would later manifest in the star's numerous cosmetic procedures. He denied Michael affection or praise, even as he pushed him relentlessly toward success. Dr. Gail Gross, a child development and human behavior expert who never treated Jackson but has studied his case, explains, "When a child experiences violence and humiliation from a parent, the very person who should provide safety and affirmation, it creates a fundamental rupture in their sense of security. The world becomes dangerous, unpredictable, and the child develops coping mechanisms to survive." For Michael, these coping mechanisms took several forms, all of which would shape his adult life in profound ways. First was perfectionism. If he could just perform flawlessly, perhaps the beatings would stop. Second was a desperate need for approval and love from audiences, filling the void his father left. Third was a retreat into fantasy and imagination, creating inner worlds where he felt safe and in control. Compounding the trauma of abuse was the complete absence of a normal childhood. By age 5, Michael was rehearsing daily under Joseph's demanding eye. By age 6, he was performing in strip clubs and bars, venues completely inappropriate for a child. By age 10, he was an international star, bearing the weight of his family's financial success on his small shoulders. "I didn't have the childhood that I wanted," Michael told Oprah Winfrey in his famous 1993 interview. "There was no Christmas, there was no birthdays, it was not a normal childhood, nor the normal pleasures of childhood. Those were exchanged for hard work, struggle, and pain." This premature thrust into adult responsibilities, combined with exposure to adult environments while still developmentally a child, created what psychologists call asynchronous development, when certain aspects of a person develop faster or slower than is typical, creating internal conflicts and confusion. Michael Jackson experienced a profound developmental paradox, explains clinical psychologist Dr. Nancy Irwin. He was hypermature in some ways, a professional performer with adult pressures and expectations, while emotionally remaining at the developmental stage where his trauma occurred. This creates a kind of psychological freeze, where aspects of the personality stop developing while others continue. This developmental paradox helps explain one of the most misunderstood aspects of Jackson's adult life, his relationships with children. The Neverland Ranch, with its amusement park rides, zoo, and constant presence of children, was not merely an eccentric celebrity indulgence. Through the lens of trauma psychology, it appears as an attempt to reclaim and recreate the childhood Jackson never had. When trauma occurs during a specific developmental stage, there's often a subconscious drive to return to that stage and get it right, to experience what was missed, explains trauma specialist Dr. James Gordon. Creating Neverland allowed Michael to construct the magical childhood he was denied, and sharing it with children allowed him to experience it vicariously. This perspective doesn't address or negate the serious allegations that were made against Jackson during his lifetime, allegations he consistently denied and for which he was acquitted in his 2005 trial. But it does provide context for understanding behaviors that many found bizarre or concerning, including his preference for the company of children over adults. The psychological impact of Jackson's early trauma extended far beyond his relationship with childhood. It profoundly affected his sense of identity, his relationships with others, and his relationship with his own body, all themes that would play out dramatically across his adult life. Jackson's identity formation occurred under extraordinary circumstances that made it nearly impossible to develop a cohesive, authentic sense of self. As a child performer constantly in the public eye, he learned early that his value was tied to his ability to entertain, to please others, to be what they wanted him to be. His father reinforced this message through physical punishment when performances weren't perfect. The result was a fragmented sense of self, Michael the performer versus Michael the person, with the boundaries increasingly blurred. Celebrity at a young age disrupts normal identity development, explains Dr. Donna Rockwell, a clinical psychologist who specializes in fame and its psychological effects. Children need to go through a process of trying different identities, making mistakes, and gradually discovering who they authentically are. Child stars don't get this opportunity, they become fixed in a public identity before they've had a chance to develop a private one. For Jackson, this disruption was extreme. By his teens, he was already world famous, his image and persona carefully crafted for public consumption. The real Michael had little opportunity to emerge or develop naturally. In many interviews, he expressed feeling trapped by his public image, expected to always be on, to always be Michael Jackson the superstar. This identity confusion manifested in several ways throughout Jackson's adult life. His constantly changing appearance, the multiple rhinoplasties, the lightening skin, which he attributed to the skin condition vitiligo, confirmed in his autopsy, the changing facial structure, can be viewed as attempts to take control of his identity, to literally reshape himself into someone who wasn't the little boy his father had abused and the world had exploited. I think Michael was trying to erase the face that had been a commodity since childhood, suggests Dr. Sue Varma, a psychiatrist who has studied celebrity mental health. Each surgery was an attempt to claim ownership of his image, to transform himself into someone new, someone who wasn't trapped in the painful past. Jackson's relationship difficulties also stemmed directly from his traumatic childhood. Trust was nearly impossible for someone whose primary caregiver had been abusive and whose value had always been tied to performance. Friendships often collapsed under the weight of his fame and insecurity. Romantic relationships were complicated by his stunted emotional development and the power imbalance his celebrity created. His two marriages, to Lisa Marie Presley, 1994 to 1996, and Debbie Rowe, 1996 to 1999, were both short-lived. Presley, who perhaps uniquely understood Jackson's situation as a fellow child star, later described their relationship as genuine but acknowledged the significant psychological barriers Jackson faced to intimacy. He had been conditioned to not trust anyone for his entire life, Presley said in a 2010 interview with Oprah. I was getting pulled into the pattern of, "Can I trust you?" It just got really difficult. Perhaps most tragically, Jackson's relationship with his own body was profoundly damaged by his early experiences. The physical abuse at his father's hands, the early objectification as a performer, and the constant scrutiny of his appearance created a deep disconnect between Jackson and his physical self. This disconnection manifested in several ways. There were the well-documented cosmetic procedures, which continued despite increasingly obvious risks and complications. There was his apparent discomfort with sexuality, which many who knew him attributed to his premature exposure to adult sexuality during the Jackson 5's performances in strip clubs and on the Chitlin circuit of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And there was his complex relationship with pain and medication. The physical pain began with a 1984 accident while filming a Pepsi commercial, when pyrotechnics set his hair on fire, causing second-degree burns to his scalp. This initiated a relationship with painkillers that would continue throughout his life, eventually contributing to his death in 2009 from acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication. Dr. Drew Pinsky, addiction medicine specialist, has suggested that Jackson's medication use wasn't solely about physical pain management. Physical pain and emotional pain activate the same pathways in the brain. For someone with significant childhood trauma, physical pain can become a proxy for emotional suffering, and pain medication can temporarily relieve both. Despite these profound psychological challenges, Jackson achieved a level of success and artistic innovation that seems almost miraculous in context. This raises one of the most interesting questions about trauma and psychology. Can trauma, despite its devastating impacts, also be a catalyst for exceptional achievement? The concept of post-traumatic growth, positive psychological change experienced as a result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances, may offer some insight into Jackson's extraordinary creativity and drive. Some trauma survivors develop enhanced capacities in specific areas as a direct result of their attempts to cope with trauma, explains Dr. Richard Tedeschi, who along with Dr. Lawrence Calhoun developed the concept of post-traumatic growth. These can include increased compassion for others' suffering, greater appreciation for life, discovery of personal strength, spiritual development, and enhanced creativity. For Jackson, music and dance became not just his career but his salvation, the places where he felt most alive, most authentic, and safest. His perfectionism, while psychologically burdensome, also drove him to practice and innovate relentlessly. His need for approval motivated him to connect with audiences in unprecedented ways. His retreat into imagination fueled his creative vision. The Thriller music video, widely considered the greatest music video of all time, exemplifies how Jackson's psychological complexities translated into artistic brilliance. The transformation from innocent to monster, the blurring of reality and fantasy, the playful approach to dark fears, all reflect themes directly connected to Jackson's psychological landscape. His songwriting, too, often touched on themes related to his experiences. Childhood explicitly addresses his lost innocence. Scream expresses rage at media persecution. Man in the Mirror speaks to the possibility of personal transformation and redemption. Through his art, Jackson processed his pain while connecting with millions who found their own struggles reflected in his music. Jackson's humanitarian work also suggests elements of post-traumatic growth. His commitment to children's causes, including his Heal the World Foundation and his frequent hospital visits to sick children, reflected his heightened empathy for suffering and his desire to prevent others from experiencing the pain he had endured. By 2000, he was certified by the Guinness Book of World Records as the pop star who supported the most charities. Yet the same psychological dynamics that fueled his success also contained the seeds of his destruction. The perfectionism that drove artistic innovation became an unbearable burden. The need for approval made him vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous business associates. The retreat into fantasy became, at times, a disconnection from reality that impaired his judgment. As Jackson's fame increased throughout the 1980s, so did his isolation and psychological distress. After the unprecedented success of Thriller, which created expectations no human could sustainably meet, he retreated further into his private world, increasingly separated from stabilizing influences and reality checks. The first allegations of inappropriate behavior with children emerged in 1993, creating a media firestorm that would follow Jackson for the rest of his life. While he maintained his innocence and the case was settled out of court, the psychological impact was devastating. For someone whose entire self-worth was built around being loved and accepted, the public vilification was traumatic in itself. The accusations against Michael, regardless of their veracity, would have re-triggered his childhood trauma in profound ways, explains trauma specialist Dr. Van der Kolk. Being judged, being seen as bad, losing public approval, these would activate the same psychological wounds inflicted by his father's abuse and criticism. The years following these allegations saw Jackson's behavior become increasingly erratic. His appearance continued to change dramatically. His financial decisions became more questionable. His dependency on medication increased. The birth of his children, Prince Michael in 1997, Paris in 1998, and Prince Michael II, known as Blanket, later BG. In 2002, brought periods of stability and joy, but the underlying psychological issues remained unresolved. In 2003, a second set of allegations led to criminal charges and a highly publicized trial in 2005. Though Jackson was acquitted on all counts, the process was psychologically devastating. Forced to sit in court daily while his private life was dissected and judged, Jackson visibly deteriorated physically and mentally throughout the proceedings. Following the trial, Jackson left the United States, living nomadically in Bahrain, Ireland, and Las Vegas before settling in a rented mansion in Los Angeles in preparation for his planned This Is It concert series in London, shows that were intended to restore his finances and reputation but would never take place. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died from cardiac arrest induced by acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication. He was 50 years old. The circumstances of his death, alone in a rented house, under the care of a personal physician later convicted of involuntary manslaughter, reflected the isolation and vulnerability that had characterized much of his life despite his global fame. Looking at Jackson's life through the lens of trauma psychology offers a more nuanced understanding of the man behind the myths and tabloid caricatures. Neither the angelic musical genius nor the disturbed Wacko Jacko captures the complex reality of a human being shaped by extraordinary talent, extraordinary trauma, and the unique pressures of unprecedented fame. What lessons can be drawn from Michael Jackson's psychological journey? Perhaps the most important is the profound and lasting impact of childhood experiences on adult development. The abuse Jackson suffered as a child didn't end when the physical blows stopped, it continued to shape his identity, relationships, and choices throughout his life. Childhood trauma is not something you get over or move past, explains Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, a seminal work on trauma's effects. It fundamentally alters your neurobiology, your perception of safety, your capacity for trust and connection. Recovery requires recognition of these impacts and specific therapeutic interventions. Whether Jackson ever received appropriate therapeutic support for his childhood trauma remains unclear. There are reports of various therapists and mental health professionals in his life at different points, but the effectiveness of these interventions, particularly given the distorting influence of his fame and wealth, is unknown. What is clear is that the psychological support systems available to child performers in the 1960s and 1970s were minimal to non-existent. There were no studio teachers mandated to be present during the Jackson 5's early performances in adult venues, no counseling services required for child stars, no recognition of the unique developmental challenges these children faced. Today, due in part to greater awareness of cases like Jackson's, there are more protections in place. The Coogan Law ensures that a portion of child performers' earnings is set aside in a trust they can access as adults. Studio teachers are required on set not just for academic education but to monitor working conditions and children's welfare. Organizations like A Minor Consideration, founded by former child star Paul Peterson, advocate for young performers' rights and well-being. Yet many of the fundamental challenges remain. Child stars still face extraordinary pressure, premature exposure to adult realities, and the complex task of developing an authentic identity under public scrutiny. the entertainment industry still prizes marketability over psychological well-being. Parents still sometimes exploit their talented children for financial gain or vicarious success. Another crucial lesson from Jackson's life is the double-edged nature of fame, particularly early fame. While it brought him adulation, wealth, and a platform for his extraordinary talent, it also isolated him, distorted his relationships, and exposed him to exploitation. Fame became both his identity and his prison. Fame is one of the most psychologically challenging human experiences possible, explains Dr. Donna Rockwell. It creates a false sense of being known and understood while actually increasing isolation. For someone like Michael Jackson, who became famous as a child and never knew life without it, the psychological impact is almost impossible to overstate. This perspective helps explain Jackson's lifelong struggle to distinguish between being loved as a person and being loved as an icon. His constant testing of friendships, his distrust of others' motives, his retreat into the company of children, who he perceived as loving him authentically rather than for his celebrity, all reflect the fundamental insecurity that fame often creates. Jackson's relationship with his own racial identity also provides important insights into the complex interplay between trauma, identity, and social expectations. As a black child star in the 1970s, Jackson faced additional layers of scrutiny and pressure. His father's reported taunts about his nose and appearance took place in a society that privileged Eurocentric beauty standards. His career advancement required navigating the racial politics of the music industry, where black artists were often marginalized or constrained by stereotypical expectations. The changes in Jackson's appearance over time, particularly his lightning skin, which he attributed to vitiligo, a condition confirmed in his autopsy, became a flashpoint for discussions about racial identity and authenticity. While many interpreted these changes as rejection of his blackness, a trauma-informed perspective suggests a more complex reality. A man attempting to take control of a body that had been objectified and commodified since childhood. For survivors of childhood abuse, the body often becomes a site of reclaiming control, explains Dr. Joy DeGruy, author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. When that abuse intersects with racial trauma, the relationship with physical appearance becomes even more complex. It's too simplistic to view Jackson's appearance changes as just about race or just about his individual psychology. They were about both, interacting in unique ways. Jackson's psychological journey also illuminates the often misunderstood concept of the inner child, the emotional state that stores childhood experiences and carries them into adulthood. In Jackson's case, this inner child was prominently present in his adult life, in his love of amusement parks and games, his childlike speech patterns, his desire to create magical experiences for children at Neverland. Rather than dismissing these behaviors as merely eccentric or regressive, trauma psychology recognizes them as attempts to meet needs that went unfulfilled in childhood, for play, for safety, for joy unconnected to performance or profit. When childhood needs aren't met appropriately, they don't simply disappear, explains child development specialist Dr. Bruce Perry. They persist, driving behaviors that may seem inappropriate for the person's chronological age but make perfect sense in relation to their emotional development and unmet needs. This doesn't mean Jackson was stuck as a child psychologically. His artistic sophistication, business acumen, at least early in his career, and ability to perform adult functions all demonstrate adult capabilities. Rather, it suggests a fragmented developmental progression, where different aspects of his personality developed at different rates due to his unusual circumstances and experiences. Perhaps the most poignant insight from Jackson's psychological journey is the profound loneliness that can exist at the pinnacle of fame. Despite being loved by millions, Jackson often spoke of feeling isolated, misunderstood, and alone. His few close friendships, with figures like Elizabeth Taylor and Macaulay Culkin who understood the pressures of early fame, were precious precisely because they were rare. The paradox of Michael Jackson was that he was simultaneously the most seen person on the planet and the least known, reflects cultural critic Touré. Everyone recognized his face, but almost no one understood his reality. That creates a profound existential loneliness. In the years since Jackson's death, public understanding of trauma, mental health, and the psychological effects of fame has evolved significantly. There is greater recognition of how childhood experiences shape adult lives, more awareness of the unique challenges faced by child performers, and more nuanced conversations about how race, gender, fame, and trauma interact. This evolution allows us to look back at Michael Jackson's life with more compassion and understanding than was often afforded him during his lifetime. Rather than focusing solely on his eccentricities or controversies, we can recognize the remarkable resilience he demonstrated in creating transcendent art despite his psychological wounds. Traumatized people are not damaged or broken, emphasizes trauma specialist Janina Fisher. They have developed adaptations to survive overwhelming experiences. When we understand behavior as an adaptation rather than a character flaw or eccentricity, it opens the door to compassion. This doesn't mean absolving Jackson of responsibility for his adult choices or dismissing legitimate concerns about his behavior. Rather, it means contextualizing those choices and behaviors within the complex reality of his life experience, recognizing that he, like all humans, was shaped by forces both within and beyond his control. If Michael Jackson had been born 20 years later, would his story have ended differently? Would today's greater awareness of trauma's impacts, improved child performer protections, and more sophisticated mental health treatments have changed his trajectory? It's impossible to know, but the question itself highlights how far our understanding has come. What we do know is that the little boy from Gary, Indiana who was thrust onto stage before he lost his baby teeth carried the wounds of that experience throughout his extraordinary life. The very adaptations that helped him survive his childhood, perfectionism, people-pleasing, fantasy, and performance, contributed to both his unprecedented success and his ultimate struggles. The creator of Neverland, the inventor of the moonwalk, the king of pop, behind these achievements was a human being doing his best to heal, to connect, and to transform his pain into something beautiful that would touch millions. In his music, his dance, and his humanitarian work, Michael Jackson found ways to channel his trauma into creation rather than destruction. Heal the world, make it a better place, for you and for me and the entire human race, Jackson sang in one of his most beloved songs. Perhaps in understanding his psychological journey more deeply, we take one small step toward that healing, not just for his legacy, but for all who struggle with the lasting impacts of childhood trauma. If a therapist could have spoken to child Michael Jackson, they might indeed have seen a boy never allowed to fully grow up. But they would also have seen extraordinary resilience, creativity, and capacity for connection despite profound adversity, qualities that would enable that child to change music history while carrying wounds that never fully healed.